Now, as I mentioned, if the buffering subsystem or the PI API buffer server were to fail in any way, you would need to know about that. You'd need to know that we are actively buffering more data than we're able to retrieve, once the server's recovered. So we do have a couple of utilities to help you monitor that. For API buffer server, there's a utility called buffutil, and we're actually going to use that in exercise 11 later on. For the PI buffer subsystem, you can use that in interactive mode, and you can see some statistics on buffering. I guess for the proper interpretation of those, what you see here, we would probably ask you to give us a call on tech support. Again, I will demonstrate how you can use buffutil. Now, in order to enable buffering on an acquisition node, it's really quite simple. We go into the interface configuration utility, and we specify under Tools, Buffering, we specify which one of the buffering systems we'd like to use. And we can either disable it entirely, or we can enable it using the new buffering subsystem. Now, in point of fact, in this case, I can't demonstrate that because I'm actually running off of a machine that has a PI server installed on it. I'm sorry about that. That's one of the failings of my setup here, a demo machine that can be used either as a server or an API node or an interface node. But in any event, if this were a pure interface node, we would see this option available. That would be the buffering subsystem. And then again, the other is to use the traditional PI buffer server. So we could specify that here. Now also, this is where we could specify certain settings. Again, I would strongly recommend that you be on the phone with technical support before you start changing some of these things. We do document some of these. You'll find some of this in the documentation. But what we've tried to do is make the system flexible enough so that under a variety of circumstances, depending on what you're trying to do, we'll be able to accommodate that. So for some people who have very, very large packets of information that are coming in relatively sparsely, not very frequently, versus people who are getting smaller packets but they're coming in non-stop, we may actually go in and recommend some changes there. But again, I wouldn't do that without being on the phone with technical support. Now, in the event that you're making use of the API buffer server, then you would need to specify what the which servers among the servers that you are familiar with, that the system knows about, are going to be buffered and which are going to be replicated. Now, my default server is mobile VBC, and that is going to be buffered, in which simply means that we're turning buffering on. Now, if we are doing using the API buffer server to do the n-way buffering, we would specify the servers that would be replicated by choosing replicated. Those would be all the servers to which we would replicate the data. You may have noticed in earlier videos that if you do have buffering configured, but you do not have a dependency for buffering, that interface configuration utility will warn you about that. So to give you an example, if you look at our services here, this is the list of services and the dependencies for this interface. API buffer is not listed there. So if I were to go in and look at this, it's going to tell me that particular interface does not have a dependency on API buffer server, and it's going to give you an option to add that. So as you can see, it's now added that as a dependency. This is very important because since buffering is enabled, the bufserv executable has to start and establish a connection to the PI server before the interface does. So we must make that interface dependent on bufserv. I'd also like to point out that there is a second method for configuring buffering, and that is in the PI system management tools themselves. So if you go into the interfaces section under buffer server, you'll see the same configuration options we saw before. And actually from here, really quite nice, you can, if it were running, you could run the buffutil utility instead of doing that from the DOS prompt and see the activity of your buffering. So let me just try to summarize what we've discussed about buffering so far. Simply put, you make sure within ICU that you've configured buffering for the interface, and make sure that that the dependencies are set up properly. And as long as you are pointing yourself to the right directory, or to the right PI server, as long as you're configured so that the interface is sending this information to the correct PI server, and that's generally done over here in the general settings, then you should start buffering to that server. Now later on we're going to be using the OPC interface. Let me go ahead and save any changes. No, I hadn't made any changes. Later on we're going to use the OPC interface in exercise 11. We are going to be turning on buffering for that, so it simply means I have to ensure that I'm pointing my data to the right server, mobile VBC. That's my PI server to which I'm sending this data. I need to make sure buffering is enabled. Okay. If you look at buffered servers, you can see by default that default server is going to be buffered. And then finally we should make sure that the dependency for buffserv is set. So if you don't, or you could have done this proactively originally, just set that to buffserv and save this, and then at that point you won't get that warning anymore. But simply put, that we are checking to see if buffserv is running because buffering has been configured over here. And that's all we need to do in order to enable buffering. And when we actually start up buffering, we'll be able to use the utilities like buffutil to monitor whether buffering is in fact working.